What is happening, everybody? So, cold air intakes. Why am I so hesitant to recommend them? Well, let me give you some background on me. And by the way, this video is probably going to be the sure cure for insomnia. I will probably rattle on for quite a while, but I want to make this discussion as thorough as I possibly can. So please forgive me in advance if I have to backtrack a little bit and pick up on some things that I may have already said. But again, background on me, I've been an avid enthusiast in terms of either building engines, working on cars, motorcycles for about the last 20 years. At one point in time, I was moonlighting as a dyno operator, and I have experience with testing different components as well, whether it was cold air intakes versus stock air boxes, intake manifolds versus various intake manifolds versus stock, different exhaust combinations. All of these are things that I have actually done myself. So getting to this cold air intake thing, one of the issues that I have with the cold air intake are, well, in the claims that the manufacturers will make in terms of what kind of gains that you can expect. Well, what I want to do is I want to enlighten some folks that may be on the fence, or if you've got a cold air intake and you've seen gains, let me tell you where some of those gains have come from. And again, I don't want this to be misconstrued. I'm not knocking cold air intakes per se, and I'm not trying to cold air intake shame anybody. What I want to do is I just want to bring to light some of the bullshit that manufacturers have fed enthusiasts for a long time. So, first of all, getting into the claims. Look, first of all, if you're going to be making a cold air intake for a car, you've got to be able to substantiate it somehow, or else it's simply not going to be sold. You've got to at least say that it does something better than your stock system that you're replacing it with. For the most part, most cold air kits only do one thing fairly well, and that is to either make your inlet charge cooler or at least more consistent, but that window of opportunity for that gain is extremely narrow. And what I mean by that is on the dyno. And there's some things at the drag strip you can do to get some benefit out of a cold air, but I'll get to that. Let's get to the dyno first. First of all, the dyno is not a real world situation. It is a laboratory situation. You have a car sitting on a set of rollers with a big set of fans sitting right up in front of the nose of the car with the hood propped open. Now, most of the OE inlet tracks are going to be a box style inlet track. Because of that, they can't get heat soaked. Whereas most cold air kits are more along the lines of an open air filter element, just more or less sitting somewhere in the engine compartment. Now, there are some box styles that are available, and I don't want to get this too convoluted, so let's go with that open filament or open air filter first. If you compare those stock systems to that open filament on a dyno, you may in fact see a gain. But that gain is mainly due to the fact that that open filter has got direct line of sight access to ambient air. And it's ambient air that's being stirred up by a fan and being wafted under the hood of that car. In that case, yes, you may see a gain simply because it's sitting on the dyno in those conditions. But there's more to it than that. See, you've got to remember that manufacturers are doing everything that they can to eke every bit of efficiency out of their engines, but they have to do it within the confines of, number one, potential EPA regulations. It could also have to do with noise regulations, although I don't see how an intake would make that much of a racket. But the other thing that it has to do is it has to give a warrantable amount of air filtration. In other words, you're not getting crap into your engine. And it has to be able to at least do a substantially good part at mitigating water infiltrating the system itself. Because of that, yes, you can have some minor amount of restriction, but the engineers look at it and think, okay, well, we're not talking about a huge percentage in horsepower or efficiency in terms of being able to turn every molecule of air into horsepower, but that is a strong enough compromise between the warrantability, the safety of the engine itself. They deem that as a fair trade-off. You might lose 3 or 4 horsepower, but you gain a much larger magnitude of confidence that the engine will be safe, clean running in terms of particulates in the air getting into your engine. So let's talk about that, particulates of air getting into your engine. Another way that cold air intake manufacturers will try to bump up power is by using a much less restrictive air filter than the stock filter. And I've done a video on this, and it was basically like which filter is best for your SRT powered car. It was more or less me showing you guys filters from the leg maker intake, which I tested, track tested, the Mopar cold air intake, which I didn't even bother track testing that. Once I started data logging it on the street, I just took the thing off the car. It wasn't worth it. But I also had the stock filter from the 392, and I also had a Hellcat filter. Now, the stock air filter in the 392 cars, I will admit, is restrictive. It flows about 750 CFM when it's completely clean. But with 75 grams of contaminant, it only flowed about 500. Well, the 392 needs a minimum of about 800 CFM to work properly. So by that standard, yes, simply replacing it with a freer flowing air filter, you could see some slight gain. In this case, I used the Hellcat air filter. Few reasons. One, it's an OE part, which means it's been tested and run through the minds of some genius engineers, I'm sure, and it is fit to be in an OE application. That being said, it also flows somewhere around 1100 CFM when it's clean, and with 75 grams of contaminant will flow just a little bit less at about 730 CFM than the 392's air filter, which came with its stock. In that case, the air filter itself is absolutely no restriction, or at least as small of a restriction as possible. The other filters, though, you could almost make a case that they're compromising filtration for flow. And for me, well, I don't necessarily want to make that compromise. I want my engine to last a good long time. And although, yes, AEM, K&N, green, all of these filters do a great job, provided that you maintain them properly. The only thing I have to do with these OE filters is throw them away. So it makes my life a lot easier, and it gives me that nice warm and fuzzy feeling knowing that I'm using an OE part to achieve what goals that I have had and which goals that I have actually accomplished with my car. So there's that avenue that they can take. Now, there's some other things. Now, being a dyno operator in the past, I can tell you that in many cases when guys would bring their cars to the dyno, they would want to have that car dynoed right away. So the car comes in and it's hot. Roll the thing onto the rollers, strap everything down, get the go-ahead, paperwork signed, and start making hits. That process only takes about 15 minutes. And realistically speaking, when you're looking at it from this point of view, heat soak, it's not uncommon for if the car particularly, my Challenger doesn't have this, but a lot of cars do, trucks do too, clutch fans. Clutch fans are still heat soaked, they're hot. So that particular fan is going to draw about 10 horsepower to 15 horsepower to spin. That power doesn't make it to the rear wheels. In the time it takes to swap parts out from a stock air box to a, insert cold air kit here, the fan has cooled off, so now the viscous fluid in that fan is now much less thick, much less viscous, and because of that, the fan spins more freely. You get a little bit of a gain at the rear wheels with that. It's just part of the whole dyno experience, but you need to know this kind of stuff going into it. And yeah, a lot of guys don't. So there's something else to consider. Cat over temp can come into play, but I don't really want to focus too much on the cat over temp, although that particular parameter in the tune, it does enrichen the fuel mixture. You're only looking at maybe 5 to 7 horsepower, but if you dynoed a car right off the street and you've made 3 or 4 wide open pulls and those cats get hot, the O2 start to cover the temp and you start fattening up the mixture, well, in just about the amount of time it takes you to put that cold air on the car, well, everything's cooled off enough. And when you make those 3 passes back to back, you never get the system hot enough to trigger that parameter in the computer. Again, a gain, but it didn't necessarily come from that cold air. But between the cold air, getting fresh air with the hood open, and cat over temp not kicking on, you could see a pretty significant gain there. But in the real world, it will not really exist. So there's another side to the cold air intake thing that, well, a lot of times guys just don't seem to think too much about. Now, this is for guys with mass air cars, cars that use a mass air meter to measure the amount of air coming into your engine. In some cases, the mass air flow meter itself is in the inlet tube. And some manufacturers have put together cold airs that will tell you, oh, you don't have to worry about getting a tune. The diameters and everything will work just fine with your stock equipment. Well, that may be true, but check it just to make sure. Because in some cases, because the diameter of that pipe may be slightly larger, you're going to now have although the same volume of air going through the pipe, but at a lower velocity, which means that the mass air meter, that filament, is not being cooled as much because the velocity of air going across it is not going to cool the filament as much as the same amount of air at a higher velocity, which means you're going to be running a bit lean. So your gain in power could simply be coming from the fact that you're leaning it out because your mass air meter is just not reading the right amount of flow. So there's a ton of different reasons why a cold air intake can pick up power on a car when in the real world that cold air intake is not really doing anything. Now, I know a lot of times guys will say, well, it feels like it's faster or it's got better throttle response. Maybe. I've never experienced that with a cold air myself. I've never put a cold air intake on a car, whether it's been one that I've fabricated or one that I've bought. I've never seen an increase in throttle response, but there is a bit of a placebo effect. And yeah, I know nobody likes to hear that kind of stuff, but believe me, if I've spent money on an intake, I want there to be some kind of a gain at least. So, but getting into track testing and where a cold air intake can actually help. So let me give you a scenario. You're at the drag strip and you're in the staging lanes. You pop your hood open, and if you've got a stock air box, that air box will probably begin to get heat soaked at some point, mainly because you've got the fans that are blowing, the fans through the radiator, blowing hot air all over them. There's that to consider. If you're not popping your hood open, then you're just basically iglooing all that hot air in there. If you have a cold air in an open filament or open air filter, pop your hood open, fire the car up. A lot of times what you can do is you can cool your intake off basically because now your filter is getting cold air because it's at least ambient at that point. But all that benefit goes away as soon as that hood is shut. So just keeping that in mind, that was the one test that I do kind of regret not doing with that Mopar cold air intake. But when I started doing the data logs, the intake air temp was just climbing. And by simply rolling on the throttle, I wasn't able to cool it off. And believe me when I tell you, I had figured out a way to snake tubes into the box to try to cool it off through the headlight inlet. I did everything I really could to try to get as much cold air to that filter as possible. And still, I could not manage to get those temps down. So yeah, for me, it was just going to be a wash. Not to mention the fact I had just got through testing the leg maker, and although it didn't provide any real gains at the drag strip, the one really good thing that it did was it helped to keep a more consistent inlet air temperature over the stock box. It just simply didn't heat up as high, and or at least when it did heat up, it wouldn't heat up as quickly, and it never really got quite as hot. But in terms of actual gains at the drag strip, I just never picked up any. So I'm hoping that helps get some, if you're not really well versed in this kind of stuff, I'm hoping that gets a little bit of knowledge your way. I don't want to discourage anybody from buying a cold air kit in different setups. Yeah, there are some that I like more than others, and what I would prefer to see is some type of an enclosure, something along the lines of maybe a large conical filter in an enclosure with the means to pull air from inner fender wells or from other areas of the car. Those are a marketable increase over the stock just in terms of flow, but they will still succumb to heat soak. Now, I guess this is me just kind of talking here. All the testing that I've done and all the data that I've collected, it doesn't really mean much in the grand scheme of things, in a way, if you look at it like this. If you're buying a cold air kit to stay involved in the hobby with your car, that's really all that matters. Yeah, you might not get any real performance gain from it, but at least you're staying involved in the car. And keep in mind that if it really is a question of performance, a drop-in aftermarket filter will probably get you 95 to 98% of what a very good cold air kit will get you in terms of any gain, and it will come at a fraction of the cost. And God, I'm just like you guys. I'm on a budget with this stuff. I can't just go out and buy a bunch of parts and just have them, on the car unless they're actually doing some good. And although for the channel I've purchased some parts to, do some testing, keep in mind I'm not sponsored and I'm under no obligation to, well, let me rephrase that. I don't feel compelled to sugarcoat any testing that I've done with any parts that I've put on my car, because it was my money, my time, and basically, in the case of the leg maker, me hacking up my car to get those results. And when it's simply not worth it, I don't want to say, well, in some cases, yeah, you might find some good in it, unless that window is specifically pointed out by the manufacturer. You're going to be misled. And that's why I've always with my channel tried to give as unbiased and be as transparent as I possibly can be. Because I've been in the same situation as you guys. I've bought parts because manufacturers say, yes, you will get a 15 horsepower increase, only to put the parts on the car, on the dyno, not see any increase, and to have the conversation with the manufacturer and they say, well, it's up to 15 horsepower. In other words, it's not going to give you 15 horsepower on a stock car. It'll give you 15 horsepower over the stock airbox and air filter on a built car. In other words, the most you could ever hope to ever get out of this part is 15 horsepower. Well, if 15 horsepower is a small fraction of the power that car is really making, what's the point? I'd rather roll stealth anyway. And especially if I had a Hellcat, because the Hellcat system, well, damn, it's already been proven to support well over 700 horsepower to the rear wheels, with the only real gain with a cold air intake has been maybe 25 some odd horsepower. And that's on a vehicle, that's on an engine platform that's already making 700 plus to the wheels on a modified Hellcat. So again, just wanted to give you guys my thoughts. I wanted to clarify a few things. Cold air intakes work really well for some applications. If the intake is intentionally restrictive due to environmental concerns, be it EPA or conditions that the vehicle is going to be driven in, if the inlet is seemingly overly complicated, it's only to try to mitigate water infiltration, dust, things like that. On a vehicle with that type of an intake, yes, you may see more of a gain with a cold air intake, but for the most part, unless the car is on a dyno and under very specific conditions, you're not going to see any real gain from running that cold air intake, with the exception of if the cold air intake is doing something to slow the air running across the mass air filter or mass air meter in a mass air car, which would yield a somewhat leaner condition in terms of air-fuel ratio under wide open throttle conditions or under partial throttle conditions. And that's it. Oh, and one other thing. Some of the cold air kits will say no tune required. Some of them will say, well, you need a tune to work with this cold air. That's no joke. If you think you can get away with a cold air that does require a tune without putting a tune on your car, you're running a serious risk of leaning that thing out too much. And what happens in that case is the mass airflow, basically the transfer curve, what the computer reads as the air flowing through that engine, that's on a mass air car one of the most important scalars you can adjust. I know this just with my background in tuning, whether it was CalCon, Cal Edit with the Mustangs, or SET Pro, or admittedly, I don't know a whole lot about HP tuners, but I've got the full system, so I am learning. But anyway, getting back to it, if those systems are put on your car and you do not have access to somebody that can flash a tune for you, yeah, you do run a very real risk of leaning your car out. Or if nothing else, you run a bad tank of gas through that thing, it's going to make it a lot more susceptible to pinging with questionable fuel quality, which is a whole different story altogether. So at any rate, post up your comments. That's a wrap on this one. Y'all have a great one. Adios.